Welcome back, everyone, from that short break. Our next presentation is I Ain't Afraid of No Ghost Kitchen. We do have additional links for you to view on the Files tab next to the chat in Passable for this topic and also the next topic. So next to the chat, there's a poll tab and there's also a file tab, and there's additional links for you to look at. So our next moderator is Troy Huffman, Retail Food Safety Team Coordinator for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Troy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tracinda, and welcome everyone to this section of our presentations today. Very excited to bring to you our topic on ghost kitchens and bringing that forward. It's interesting that some of you maybe had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Jajek earlier today on one of the other regions, where he specifically called out their webinar, which was one of the most viewed webinars that they had on exactly that topic. Earlier today, there was also the Ghost Kitchen 101 with the Northeast region. So it's definitely a topic that everyone is interested in. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to bring a couple of different perspectives, I feel, to the discussion. We have Patrick Guzzle, who is the Vice President of Food Science with the National Restaurant Association, is going to be presenting, kind of giving us some of the mechanics behind ghost kitchens and the information associated with that. We also then have Frank Curto, who is the Senior Director of Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs at Territory Foods. So a little bit about Patrick, who's going to go first here on our discussion to start out our conversation. Patrick has been involved in retail food safety for almost 20 years. After his wife, Diane, unfortunately contracted E. coli 015787 at that time, he was pursuing a completely different career path. His career in food safety began as an environmental health specialist in Southeast Idaho Public Health District. He later became the environmental health supervisor and was involved in all aspects of environmental health, as we commonly do at the local level. So then in 2004, Patrick was hired by the Idaho Food Protection Program Manager, was the capacity that he operated in with the state's Division of Public Health. During that time, he served as a president of the Idaho Environmental Health Association. And in 2018, Patrick made a little bit of a career change, still stayed within the industry for us, where he transitioned to the Mountain West Food Safety LLC, where he was the principal consultant. In addition to serving several clients, helping them strengthen their food safety efforts, he has regularly taught ServSafe courses throughout Idaho and Eastern Oregon, sorry. Patrick has been an active participant in the Conference for Food Protection, big shout out for CFP, and has served on several committees as well as chairing Council 2. And if you're familiar with CFP, being a chair is amazing, great work, by the way. He served as the chair for the CFP in 2016 and 2018 in that process. Has also served, received several commendations for his collaborative efforts over the years. He's active in AFTO, NEHA, and WAFTO. He's an adjunct professor of public health at Boise State University, has a master's in public health, master's in arts of anthropology, both from Idaho State University, as well as bachelor arts in Spanish from Idaho State University. His wife and him grew up in Colorado in the Littleton and Steamboat areas, and they have 4 children in Boise, Idaho. So just real quick, I've got a short paragraph here with Frank. Frank, thanks for joining us also. And then Patrick, we'll turn it over to you. Frank is with the Institute of Food Technologists, certified food scientist, over 20 years experience in the food industry, specializing in food safety, regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and product development. In addition to leadership roles in food industry, Frank, from the regulatory side of things, giving us that perspective, also served 6 years with the USDA FSIS as a consumer safety inspector in charge at the New York City NYC circuit. So thank you both for joining us. Like I said, Patrick's going to start out with his presentation and kind of give the mechanics behind the ghost kitchens, and then Frank's gonna have some discussion for us before we go to Q&A on the logistical aspects of ghost kitchens. So Patrick, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you all for having me today and asking me to be with you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. Since Troy went through my whole background, I will just throw out one little thing. There is a word in Spanish, at least in the Castilian version of Spanish, ojalá, which kind of means, oh, I wish that. So ojalá that we were all in person, but we're not. We're still in virtual format. So let's talk about ghost kitchens. Next slide, please. Or am I running? There we go. There might be a lot of different terms that may be used when we talk about a ghost kitchen. Virtual kitchens, delivery kitchen. I'll talk a little bit, hopefully later on, about a delivery kitchen and what it includes, or a particular example anyway of a delivery kitchen. The term might be a dark kitchen, might be a catering first kitchen. In some areas, they might be called an incubator kitchen or a commissary kitchen. For references of ghost kitchen, I'm going to use all of these terms to be somewhat interchangeable, although the background behind each of these different terms might have a slightly different connotation to it. Next slide, please. The primary outline, if you will, or the primary way to think of a ghost kitchen is these do not have a storefront. They're not intended for walk-up service. They are intended for production and delivery. So there's no real front of the house or no real dining area, okay? They are equipped with basic amenities, and the dishes really that they're preparing are generally only available for delivery. Next slide, please. I know that my colleague Frank is going to speak a little bit more about why people might choose to use a ghost kitchen. I have some information in a couple more slides coming up where I talk briefly about why people might use a ghost kitchen. The bottom line is there are a lot of different reasons why these might be used. Next slide, please. This is what I think is important to really understand here. This is done a national household survey that we do every year with the National Restaurant Association. We do that near the end of the year, and then we publish our results near the end of the year. So this was from December of last year, December 2020. Look at the number, just over half, 53% of adults now say that food delivery is essential to the way they live. Think about that for just a second. Over half of adults surveyed say that food delivery is essential to the way they live. Now, that food delivery can include a lot of different options. It can include groceries. We're talking about restaurants here today, of course. Next slide, please. So here's why people might use a ghost kitchen. First of all, generally speaking, you're going to be working with a simpler menu. The location can really reduce your overhead costs if you're operating a food establishment. Also with location, you can use it to help alleviate traffic concerns. Let me give you an example of a facility that I know I'm not going to name the name, but this is an example of how a delivery kitchen works. In this particular brand, it is a very well-known national brand. They probably have a brick and mortar location near you. At lunchtime, that brick and mortar location gets very busy, and also during the dinner rush. It caters to families. So this particular restaurant will probably have children in the parking lot. And because of they're a national well-known chain, they have a lot of deliveries, especially from third-party companies. As a way to help alleviate traffic concerns within the parking lot of these facilities, this national brand also operates delivery kitchens, which generally speaking are located near the brick and mortar location. That delivery kitchen might be in a strip mall, for example, that's somewhere near the brick and mortar location. The brand instructs third-party deliveries not to go to the actual brick and mortar restaurant, but to go to the delivery kitchen, which might be located somewhat nearby. Because of that, the restaurant, the brick and mortar location doesn't have, well, they have to worry less, I guess, about the traffic flow in and out of their parking lot. You can imagine that with a large number of guests, and then you increase it by adding third-party deliveries coming in every few minutes, it can just really logistically be difficult to help manage the traffic flow within that facility. So they operate their delivery kitchens to help manage that traffic flow a little bit better. I believe that Frank is also going to be speaking a little bit later on about the overhead costs, but I can tell you just as a precursor here that use of these kitchens can greatly reduce the overhead cost associated with operating a restaurant. Next slide, please. I was asked to kind of talk about what would a regulator need to be concerned about when it comes to looking at these possible ghost kitchens or dark kitchens, or however you want to phrase them. So I wanted to phrase, first of all, the food safety risks are going to be the same. Same as brick and mortar, we're worried about time and temperature control. We should be worried about cross-contamination issues. We should be worried about cleaning issues. We should be worried about hygiene of the employees working in that particular kitchen. All of that folds into, on the very far right-hand side of this slide, you see responsibility. Many jurisdictions will require some kind of written agreement addressing who is responsible for what. That's important because especially in some of these operations, you might have more than one restaurant operating out of this dark or ghost kitchen. So that's going to become important as far as who is responsible for what. If an inspection reveals that there is cross-contamination in the cooler, for example, who is responsible ultimately for correcting that problem? Now, a bigger concern, I think, that probably faces regulatory agencies is around licensing, especially if it's a shared facility. Who ultimately has control over the license? Now, again, in some jurisdictions, this might be individually based on the restaurant that's operating. It might be based on the building. This is an individual jurisdiction question that has to be addressed by that specific jurisdiction, because I believe that every jurisdiction might look at this a little bit differently in terms of licensing. So that is a question that needs to be considered. Who actually holds the license? Next slide, please. So in summary for my portion, here's what I want, just to kind of reiterate a few things. First of all, I'm sure you've already figured this out. Third-party delivery is here to stay. It's not going away. And in fact, if anything, it's probably going to increase. I didn't show you a number. We have statistics that indicate that almost 2/3 of millennials believe that food delivery is essential to their way of life. So I showed you the statistic that showed just over half of adults. We'll now throw in that we have information that indicates approximately 2/3 of the millennial generation believes that third-party delivery is essential to how they live. So that's going to only increase. Ghost kitchens can help. They can certainly help reduce traffic flow. They can help meet the consumer demand that is continuing to increase for these delivered foods. The general food safety risks, same as what we would see in any other food establishment. We need to be concerned about hygiene, hand washing, working while ill, cross-contamination, temperature control. All of the same food safety risks that we normally associate with food establishments apply in these same situations. We do have to rely on local regulations because as you guys all represent regulatory agencies, how one agency looks at it might be a little bit different than another agency. And so ultimately, who is responsible for what depends on what the local regulatory agency has to say about that. I believe my next slide is my final slide. Yeah, you are certainly welcome to reach out to me if you have any other questions. As Troy mentioned, I am the Vice President of Food Science with the National Restaurant Association. I can be reached through phone, email, text, a lot of different ways. And if you need contact information, I think we have it available near the end of the presentation. So thank you for your time. Troy.
Yes, Patrick, thank you so much. We did have one question. Do you know if there was the sample size on that half of the adults? Do you have any of that information? Or maybe you could look it up while Frank's given his question. Nancy on the chat had that question. They're probably not off the top of your head.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do not know the size. With this month being National Food Safety Month, I know that we're all really wrapped up with stuff. I can certainly try to look for it. I don't believe I'll be able to find it in 10 minutes.
That's fine. I just wanted to throw that out there real quick with you. But The industry is, just as we all know from the regulatory side, is usually 3 or 4 steps ahead of where we're at with regulations. Even with meeting every 2 years with the CFP, a Conference of Food Protection, and trying to make those updates to the code, that these are great conversations. And I think that COVID, obviously 18 months ago, we were not where we're at right now when it comes to this topic, and what industry has made just leaps and bounds in relation to this. So I'm gonna go ahead, and Frank, we're gonna have you kind of give us some ideas of that logistical side of things in relation to how this concept is coming and moving forward, and maybe how that might relate to the people on the call that are related to regulatory. Frank?
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Troy, and thanks, Patrick. You will be a hard act to follow, Patrick, but I'm going to try to keep this conversation moving along here. And really, I think I'm going to reiterate, and echo much of what Patrick has talked about the last few minutes in regards to the fact that ghost kitchens, I think, really are playing a very integral part of this food industry evolution that we're seeing. In many regards, companies in the industry as a whole is finding ways to reinvent themselves to meet the demand of the consumer. And at the end of the day, we all work for the consumer, and they're telling us they want food when they want it, where they want it, how they want it. And it's very tech driven, and the expectation is fast. And that is presenting some interesting challenge. And I think ghost kitchens can potentially contribute that to a meaningful way for the industry. If someone could move the next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, to just expound on that, there is an evolution or a reinvention to some regard. And again, I think what's also important to note here is, yes, consumers are telling us when, how, and where they want it, but food in general, they don't just want fast food. They want healthy food. They want chef prepared food. They want it at a fair cost, and they want it convenient. The demands are very, very high. And so from an industry point of view, and if we go to the next slide, please. The industry itself, I think, is going through a bit of a renaissance just to keep up with this demand. And it is really an exciting time for companies to get out there and get in this space and get a piece of this market share. So it's very much the food entrepreneur who's just getting in the game and are new to the business, maybe. It's evolving food service businesses, much like Territory Foods is trying to bridge the gap between the small local chef to consumers throughout the country. And then it's just the operational logistical reinventions that many companies are finding themselves in. How do I reach the customer? We got to figure that out. So we have to figure out ways to do it. Where ghost kitchens, I believe, present the best turnkey solutions is number one, and Patrick tapped into this a bit already, lower capital costs. You're not going out there building brick and mortar. In many cases, you're moving into a space that's built out. So it's in many cases, it's equipped. And so that offers a lot of flexibility of, speed to market, getting in the game quickly, and also the ability to just be flexible about it. Most of these facilities offer, they're open 24 hours a day. You can do this in your dark time if you're running another business. So presents a lot of opportunities that enable businesses to get off and running and be competitive in this space. Next slide, please. So ghost kitchens, dark kitchens, some of the other names that Patrick tapped into already. They really don't fit in one box in terms of what do they look like from a facility point of view. There's a number of different scenarios that exist. And to as much as they present shared kitchen opportunities, I think is where we start to see some complications or some challenges, if you will, start to develop that I think are important for regulators to be mindful of going into, overseeing these type of facilities, for companies like Territory that are working with a lot of smaller producers that are overseeing their food safety and empowering them to elevate their game, if you will. So I think there's a couple of dynamics that are good to understand. Number one, some of these facilities may just be self-owned and operated. And I believe Wendy's recently publicly announced that they were building out hundreds of these across the country, again, to serve that on-demand, direct-to-consumer delivery growth that they've seen in recent years, especially post-COVID. The other scenario that we see often, and probably more commonly, is an owner or property manager who now is facilitating this facility and now is either leasing it to perhaps a single tenant, which is probably the most straightforward aspect, or, which is and probably more common, might be this multiple tenant scenario. Within that scenario, there's three dynamics that I've seen very common in play, and I know our team has in the field. Number one is, it could be it could be a facility that's made up of independent kitchens where each operator has their own space. I think that's probably less common and probably presents a lot of advantages, but it is one thing that we've seen out there. Probably the more common scenario we've seen is where these facilities are 100% communal, in that they are shared. Again, within that, there are different elements of what does that mean to share a space. Could be time separation, could be some sort of physical separation, or it could be just everybody working under the roof at the same time and they're figuring out how to navigate all of that. And then lastly, some combination thereof, where there might be a common space where there is a shared cook line, for example, but then there are independent suites for operators to go maybe package their food, for example. Next slide, please. So from a risk-based food management point of view, I think kind of my thesis statement here, and I think this is kind of where there's opportunity for everyone to raise awareness levels and probably lean in and kind of help direct some of these challenges that we see. My statement here is that the more communal the facility is, the more challenges arise. And I think, as Patrick mentioned, it's the same challenges that most of these facilities are facing. I think the dynamics here are unique enough where they introduce elements of risk that create unique situations. Certainly from a business partnership point of view, which we experience in Territory Foods, I got to believe from a regulatory point of view, it's got to become a concern or at least a challenge. So these challenges, I've kind of grouped them into like 6 buckets, if you will. The first one is just the sheer nature of shared infrastructure. So an organization within an organization working next to another organization, and everyone having some form of common ground. But again, how do you designate and delineate food safety when there's common areas to be considered? So roles, responsibilities, accountability. At the end of the day, who ultimately has active managerial control if a food safety hazard is identified? Secondly, I think just the sheer resource cross-utilization of many, again, the communal spaces where this is most prominent. These are, again, a very shared facility. So they're sharing space, they're sharing equipment in many cases. And so you can imagine the increased risk for allergen cross-contact is there at some level of elevated risk, perhaps. Thinking about from some of the complexity that we see food being produced out of those facilities, a lot of it is ready to eat in nature. So thinking about the worthiness of the ready to eat food contact surface, are they worthy of direct contact with food that won't be reheated, for example, by the end user, is another situation. Communication gaps is another one. Again, as you can imagine, a lot of people involved, a lot of dynamics at play there. Some critical elements that can suffer: corrective actions, preventive maintenance, standard operating procedures, particularly around sanitation. Capacity is another element of challenge. These places get overcrowded quickly. Improper separation and segregation certainly is a challenge that arises there. Impaired cold keeping and cooling. In fact, if I was asked what is the #1 restraint in a lot of these facilities, I'd say cold keeping is one that is probably the bottleneck in most operations. Competency, I'd say, listen, these are business people, they're smart, they're wearing many hats. Do they know what they're doing? Sure. Do they have a food manager on site? Absolutely. I think more of my point here is around depth. What happens when you need to delegate food safety responsibilities down the line, a second shift, multiple departments, and so forth? That's where you start to see not enough depth in knowledge across qualified individuals in an organization. And then lastly, specialized training. I think, again, this is around some of the unique products that we see being made in these facilities. It's not just fast food. I mean, some folks are producing things like kombucha, so fermented products, products in reduced oxygen packaging. So specialized processes that need specialized training and folks that are well educated and trained in those areas is another area that, again, I think the communal aspect of it is where you see some increased challenges. Next slide, please. Okay, that's my spiel. That's my 2 cents on the subject. As Patrick mentioned, in my perspective is very industry focused. So I'm happy to expound on it. I'm happy to lean in and help or ask questions or any way that I can. So thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Thank you so much, Frank. Really appreciate that perspective for us to give us some idea. And I'm going to go back to Patrick, maybe from your regulatory side, aspect. One of the questions came in, really doesn't, Lori had asked and mentioned that this really doesn't a lot of times fit neatly into that paradigm of what we have for our current regulatory licensing structure. What feedback can you give to people that maybe are struggling with how they should fit into, or is it something that needs to be discussed further with maybe management or something like that? Frank, you could chime in too if you've got something to add.
Well, thanks, Troy. Let me try to address that a little bit. Before I do, to my surprise, I was able to get a response to the other question. So the other question asked about the survey size. We commissioned a group called Engine Group US to conduct that survey for us, and they polled 1,000 adults across the country with several questions regarding their interaction with restaurants. And again, that was done in December of 2020. So the sample size was 1,000 adults on that. Now, to address the question about how these don't fit, you're absolutely right. They don't fit into the typical structure of a restaurant and your possible licensing authority. I would recommend 2 things. When I worked for the state where I did, I would highly recommend jurisdictions contact each other. Chances are, if you're just now seeing these, nearby jurisdiction, one near you has already seen them. And you can contact your neighbors, if you will. I'm aware that, I'm familiar with the CFP really well. We're still using the term regions within CFP. I know FDA no longer has the regions, but we are kind of meeting in these regional meetings. So if you're in a Southwest state, for example, if you contact another Southwest state, chances are pretty good that they have seen some of these things. And so they might be able to help you navigate that. I do also highly recommend that, yes, you speak with the management of the facility to try to answer that question of where does this really fit. So check with your neighbors, check with neighboring jurisdictions, and do speak with the management.
Great, thank you for that. And Daniel Ludwig with Omaha actually Douglas County had an interesting comment that he had a situation where maybe vendors would actually rotate in and out on different days, depending on what may be going on. So to add to Frank, what you had mentioned about some of the timing, that's one of those components that may also be a factor to consider. But I had an interesting question here, Frank, from Mark Speltz with Iowa. And he said, we see shared spaces not only with multiple direct to consumer tenants, but also shared space with direct-to-consumer and wholesale operations. Would you be able to comment, I was thinking more from that industry side perspective that you come from, on how the industry is maybe handling the food code regulations and then also the manufactured food regulations that might be going on combined at the same space, where a lot of times in manufacturing, there's a little more latitude that might be allowed under those components, where the retail with so many different aspects going on, we require some different processes involved if they've got special process or something like that happening.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So within our production network, we have approximately 30 chefs throughout the country that we represent or act as an agent for. One of which we self-operate, and that's in Los Angeles. They operate out of a shared facility that has about 66 independent suites and several common areas, including storage, both cold and dry, and receiving, and then some packaging rooms. Within that facility, there are a handful of USDA regulated facilities. So there is a USDA inspector on site who essentially focuses it on those independent operators. There are also FDA products being produced there. I'd say the majority of the facility are direct to consumer type businesses that are operating with either a state wholesale permit or a local county jurisdiction permit. All that being said, there's lots of regulators oversight. The facility host, so the management team there, does have a team that kind of helps oversee the common areas to make sure that they're up to the highest standard, which would essentially be USDA, FDA, right? Providing ancillary services, so some sanitation, janitorial, maintenance, and things like that. Outside of that, the independent operators are typically charged with working within compliance, working within the regulations that govern their particular business and jurisdiction. So there's a lot going on there. And I think where it gets complicated is more, like I've said before, the shared areas where, for example, if there's a packaging room that two parties are sharing, does one understand that what the other party's making, if they're sharing space at the same time?
Okay, I got it. Thank you. Thank
you. Yeah, you bet. No, thank you.
All right, bye.
Sorry, I think I'm back now. So there's some challenges there where the spaces get shared, and there may be different levels of knowledge base based on the products that are being produced there. So that brings up the question: is there an opportunity for the management group to provide some sort of food safety leadership to kind of navigate some of those situations, perhaps?
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I think those are all some very, very good points that we need to take into consideration. We've got an interesting situation that one of our local agencies here in Colorado brought up during one of our meetings here a couple of weeks ago. Weld County, Nick, with their food program manager, brought up a scenario where there was an Asian concept restaurant that was actually, in addition to that, they had created a burger presence online, and it's the same staff that they were having at the Asian restaurant, that you would go in and had a front of house dining area, but they were also doing third-party delivery in relation to they were doing hamburgers. They had multiple other quote unquote virtual storefronts that were all operated out of the same kitchen. Patrick, how would you comment on a situation like that, where maybe they would have one storefront, potentially just one license, depending on how you've got that set up?
I think we start to draw some very fine lines between, is this a different establishment, or is this one establishment that is expanding their menu beyond what they were originally approved to do? the shortest answer I could give you, I guess, is I think it would depend a lot on the ownership. And ultimately, again, as I mentioned, who is responsible for what? If there are, in fact, different people involved in running the burger operation, then I think it warrants consideration as a separate food establishment. If it's the same staff members that are operating the other facility and they're simply expanding their menu, then probably they don't need oversight as a secondary license. That's my opinion. But again, I'm going to emphasize, I'm not a regulatory authority anymore. So a lot of those regulatory questions are going to have to be made at the local or state level.
Yeah, opinions are not allowed in this format at all. Don't you understand that? Of course, I'm sure. So real quick, I think we got time maybe just for one more question. And topics have been kind of thrown around, and there's some issues that came forward, and I think there's some documents available on CFP. But Frank, what are your perspective from the industry side as far as the delivery people that are involved with this entire component? Because that is a huge element in relation to this, because without those third parties, are you going to pull up to some warehouse to go pick up your meal, or through that third party? Do you feel there's some kind of responsibility or accountability on that delivery driver in relation to this whole concept?
Yeah, absolutely there is. They are the customer facing side of the equation. So they're the last mile, if you will. And for sure, I mean, I could tell you how we've approached it as a company is we feel that delivery is part of our HACCP process. So even if we are passing the baton to a third party logistics partner, for example, that they are part of our food safety system and need to carry out whatever controls we feel are necessary. And again, I think there's a lot of different things going on where you've got hot food being delivered. Can we keep it hot throughout transport? There's cold food, combinations thereof. So there's some unique challenges there. And I know it's a hot subject. Frankie Yanis, I know, is going to speak to it next month in an industry group conference there. And I think it's an element of that needs some defining, and I believe there's going to be some good ground gained in the next few months, and hopefully next year we'll kind of string it all together so it's a completely integrative food safety process.
I like that. Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
I was just going to add to that. ServSafe, our ServSafe arm, partnered with the National Environmental Health Association earlier this year. We both actually have courses already available for third-party deliveries that are fairly elementary courses. We partnered with the third-party delivery companies on creating these courses. We don't look at a lot of these delivery people as food employees in the traditional sense, in the traditional food code definition of a food employee. However, as Frank mentioned, there are certainly some critical elements that need to be discussed in terms of food safety. And so our course and the NEHA course both do outline some of those critical elements for food safety for a third-party delivery person.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Patrick. I appreciate that. So we're just about right at the very tail end of our time frame that we were going to have for this topic. Frank, I'll throw it to you. Any final parting comments?
I appreciate everybody's time. Again, I think this is here to stay, everybody. I mean, this is the industry as we know it. And so I think there's great opportunities. A lot of the folks, again, involved in the third-party delivery, some of the startup folks that are getting in the game here need help. They want to do the right thing. I think, empowering them through awareness and education is the way to get there. So we're leaning into it and are happy to be part of it and happy to kind of lead that charge where we can.
Excellent. Thank you. Patrick, do you have a quick comment before we turn it back over to Tricinda?
Well, I would just loudly echo what Frank just said. He said it very, very well. He said it certainly better than I could have said it. I would also throw out that, we with the National Restaurant Association, we're here to help too. If you've got any concerns or questions or something that's going on, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll certainly try to work with you to resolve any concerns that we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, NRA is the other NRA, an excellent partner and everything. And I had earlier, people had some comments about my poop plush pillows, so I had to bring, the other one has horns, but sorry, I slightly digressed there maybe. Trisenda, handing it back over. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.